All right, chapter 10, it's just going to be how we name and classify our plants based on a hierarchy, and then we'll talk a little bit about our germplasms. So we'll talk about, explain how the names are classified, are named and classified. We'll talk about the nomenclature for the taxonomic classification. We'll talk about how some of these crops originated and why it's important to saving that germplasm. So naming and classifying those plants, as many other organisms, is an important part of understanding them. And so a long time ago, they had this problem where I might see this magnolia tree and describe it as this and call it that. And then someone in Russia or someone in Europe might also see the same magnolia tree and they might not call it a magnolia tree. And so there was some confusion. And so eventually we needed to come up with a common system so that everyone can say, yes, this is the same plant, regardless of what you call it. The scientific name is really how we're able to identify and know what someone else is talking about. So our plants are classified basically by the regions that they grow in, because their climate and environment are going to dictate their survival. So we have 4 separate classes, whether it's Arctic or temperate, tropical and subtropical. And so the USDA has these certain hardiness zones where they find that most of the plants that are grown in here will not grow in, like let's say something that, well, take for instance tall fescue. So I'm from Mississippi, and down here we grow a lot of St. Augustine grass and Bermuda. But you don't see much St. Augustine or Bermuda in Tennessee, not as much as you would in Mississippi, because the environment's different. And you certainly wouldn't see any Bermuda or St. Augustine in Michigan. It's not warm enough. The climate, it just doesn't grow there. So those are kind of based on temperature and season. We have winter and summer annuals. We have cool season and warm season grasses. And then also by the parts of the vegetable, and whether that's fruits and seeds, stems and leaves and roots. We can have them for use as ornamental crops, so the different types of plants that we might have. We classify those as house plants, so we might have shade tolerant plants or full sun plants. We have different types of forest trees, so we have bottomland hardwoods or we have softwoods. So at minimum, plants have at least 2 names. We have a common name, and this is something that's going to reflect some characteristic. They can be very confusing because what we call magnolia here, again, might not be what they call magnolia in Spain. However that looks wherever magnolias might grow in some other parts of the world. But this scientific name is based on some scientific classification, and it's unique for species, and some of them even have a subspecies. So it's easy to identify and say yes, even though so they'll have these characteristics based upon the scientific classification from our taxonomy. You can call it something different. It doesn't have to be the same name, but like when I see something that says Typhus angustifolia, I can immediately know what the common name for that is. Or it might be something different. The common name might not be the same, but I know what it is based on that scientific classification. In the 1700s, Carolus Linnaeus was tired of trying to explain some things to people who didn't want to listen. And so he decided to come up with this system where we have these different orders or hierarchy, where we have a domain and a kingdom. So whether this is plant or animal kingdom, we have phylum and class, order and family, and then finally what we're typically used to seeing is genus and species. So here we have a domain, a kingdom, We have a phyla, which is ferns, or maybe it's a ginkgo, so seedless or seeded. And each one of those domains and kingdom and phyla are separated out into different categories where we can start to classify, or if you've ever worked with a dichotomous key, we can either say this is seedless or not. It belongs in this class or that class. So typically, if you're working with plants, you should at least know the family, the genus, and the species. That's not with all plants. In agronomy, not concerned with the family, but the genus and species, those are something that I'm going to need to know to be able to understand. If you work in horticulture or nursery and landscape management, having an understanding of what that family is going to help you manage those plants a little better. So most of those are Latin, but they may have some Greek or Arabic connotations to them. So something like reference to the leaves might be folius or phylon, phyla. Here we have that describe the sides. So let's say Abelia grandiflora. So Abelia with large leaves and flowers. Different colors could have a different name that would give you some indication of what we're talking about. Some of the native habitats, like canadensis, means it comes from Canada. Borealis could be from like a northern climate. So that binomial, the first name is the genus, second is the species, and then you may find this third part that is written as some abbreviation who first found that species. It's typically L for Linnaeus, but there are different ones. The genus is always capitalized, species is lowercase, and they're either underlined or written in italics. The authority is the binomial, follows the binomial, is capitalized, not underlined as this. See, so here we have Solanum tuberosum. This will either be all italics or underlined. Typically, if you write it, you would underline it. And then here we have the authority with L. It is capital and abbreviated. When you are naming more than one plant in a series, all from the same genus, you can abbreviate the P. You have to list it out: Prunus armeniaceae. But we can say P. domestica and P. persica. We don't have to say Prunus each time that we write that out. We can have varieties. So here is Buxus microphylla, which means that we have small leaves, and this is native to Japan. So a Japanese boxwood or a Korean boxwood. A cultivar, as we mentioned before, is that clones or lines of domesticated plants. Remember that lines are produced from seed, clones are produced from cuttings or some asexual propagation, and they are typically preceded by some CV. So we have Phaseolus vulgaris, Blue Lake cultivar. If we have cultivars within a species, we can place them in a group. Here's just an example of how we might differentiate some groups of brassicas. Families are things that have similar structures and chemical characteristics and pathways. So like latex in the milkweed family is the chemical. We might have a similar flower structure, such as the nightshade family. All families will end with ACA. The first letter is always capitalized, and it's possible to capitalize. You might see this capitalized. All the letters are of that word are capitalized. As I mentioned before, we have this dichotomous key. You decide which characteristic of the two gives the fit for your plant. It either produces seeds or it doesn't, seedless or seeds. It's either going to be in ferns or ginkgos, and then each time you go down, you will get separated into a class. You'll need to know kind of the name and locations and variations. Maybe the center of origin. So we have typically 8 centers. Central China, Indochina, Malaysia, Turkey and Iran are the Mediterranean, kind of the Middle Eastern. So here we have Eastern Asia, Middle Eastern, and then we start moving into, so this would be somewhere in Africa, and then finally into the Western Hemisphere. And then we have, let's not forget about South America. So as we mentioned before, that we had 2 types of plants. We have wild type and cultivated. If we're ever looking for a wild type to cross that plant with, we can probably look back and find that place of origin, the center of origin out of one of these 8 centers. That's where we would start to look for those plants. So about 6,000 to 5,000 BC is when we finally started domesticating plants and animals. This graphic is just showing where you can find many of those kind of the origin of many of the fruits and vegetables and foods that we eat. And so we've domesticated them to survive in the environments because we like coconut. Coconut typically over here in Southeast Asia. We typically think of maybe Hawaii, which is over here, or maybe it's over there a little bit. And then we now have coconuts in North America. So we can we can domesticate these plants through asexual, propagation, because it's easy to root cultivated woody plants, such as grapes and mulberries, pomegranates. We have tubers and rhizomes like potatoes, sweet potatoes, bananas. And then sexual propagation, if we're trying to harvest wild grass seed and then plant them next year. We actually started the process of selection by picking the best plants with the best seeds so that we could have the greatest chance of survival. And that's how we had the superior crops that we have today. So one example of that is going to be wheat. We have different types of wheat: einkorn, emmer, and then hexaploid bread wheats. So this is kind of how we went about increasing the chromosome numbers so that we could improve the superior nature and the hardiness of that wheat plant. Then we have specific cultivars that are specific to climates. Something else that might be considered in this would be like soybean. We have bred those plants to be based on maturity dates, because we still want to grow soybean in Iowa, and so we need a short maturity date. But in Mississippi, we can probably get along with a larger maturity cultivar. we're looking for disease resistance or lodging resistance. Because wheat is self-pollinating, we don't have very many F1 hybrids. Corn is probably one we're most familiar with. It comes from Teosinte. So corn probably originated looking like this or very multicolored, and now we have cultivated or domesticated that into a very uniform. So in the 30s, we started developing these hybrid types that are going to be more predictable and suited to different climates, because we started to increase our corn production across the country. We're also working on greater fertilizer use efficiency, drought stress, and some of these other mechanized processes. We're doing a lot of work in rice because it's one of the it's the largest selling grain in the world. So we have developed some of those superior qualities through work done with the USDA and the International Rice Research Institution. We have soybean that was once native to Asia, but now has grown a lot in the United States and in South America and Brazil. We made a lot of improvements between the early 1900s and the 1950s. And as I mentioned before, we've done this by making the proper bean maturity for the right area. Greater disease resistance. Some other ones have been sugar beet that we've worked on crop improvement. Potatoes, we've heard of the great potato famine where a blight knocked out the entire potato supply in Ireland. So we've bred for that disease resistance and also suitability for specific purposes. Tomatoes, kind of the same thing. So in the beginning, in colonial North America, was considered poisonous, and so we did not work on any crop improvement. But over time, we realized that they weren't poisonous, and so now we have greater disease resistance and vigorous productive plants for home gardens. Apple is one you might not be familiar with, but we're trying to improve that for use as cider. We have different varieties, so we're trying to improve fruit quality, good seedlings, and so now the cultivar numbers are increasing. Something that I want to mention about this apple thing that I believe is something that's going to be a big thing is this vernalization period. I believe that we can make great strides in reducing that vernalization requirement because we're having global warming. There's this climate change thing, and so our apple trees and our fruit trees that need vernalization are starting to suffer from that. So there are several plant improvements programs. We want to select those favorable characteristics and pass them on to other generations. In the early 1900s, we didn't know much about this until Darwin's evolutionary concepts kind of came in and believed that the abundance of those advantageous traits increase in generation, but the variation still exists. And then finally, when Mendel finally understood, kind of got a better understanding of how those mechanisms for passing traits on, and that's where we get the Punnett square. So Darwin's discovery of variation, and then Mendel's discovery of how those traits move genetically. That wasn't really recognized until the 1900s. Mendel was just a monk who was studying peas, and finally they realized that there was something to that. They understand that there are patterns of evolution in the crop genera, or in the crop genre. So we can collect and utilize much of this germplasm as resources. So if we know a specific germplasm has specific traits, we can save that, and we can at least repopulate those wild and cultivated varieties or plants. We can impart pest resistance, cold tolerance, add flavor. Well, we've been doing this in cereals and forages, fruits and vegetables and ornamentals. We've been doing this for over 120 something years, and we've gotten pretty good at it. So in the United States, the USDA is what kind of preserves or maintains those breeding programs. Private seed companies also have made new cultivars to promote their business. So the germplasm that we're looking is actually the protoplasm of the sexual reproductive cells that contain those chromosomes and genes. So plant explorers search for new germplasm. They're going around just looking for new plants that they haven't necessarily exploited yet, and trying to get that new germplasm, introduce that into existing crops, and see if there's any potential for those crops to become superior. But eventually we're going to run out of we'll run out of the genetic variation once we've acquired all the germplasms. So we had 2 international conventions that are related to this kind of thought process for plant genetics. We want to conserve and utilize our germplasm. Not that you need to know much about these, and it's not that it's going to be testable. But we have like an international convention. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity. They consider that the germplasm is part of the natural resources of that country. You need to have official consent. So they want to move these plants and germplasms internationally, so that way we can, you got to watch out for that. We can spread pests and disease from different countries, such as chestnut blight. We also have these soil-borne pests and pathogens that can come in and wipe out the existing germplasm that we currently have. So we have different protective measures for that. They're going to inspect and quarantine that for a certain period of time. There might be some fumigation. We also do this with interstate movement of some plants as well. So we have these international germplasm networks that are going to preserve that genetic diversity. So this the Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research is one of those that is a group that is working to preserve that germplasm. The World Conservation Union, they maintain the list of threatened or endangered species. So the way that works is we want to collect and store that germplasm. So that's going to have food and industrial crops with it. Some of those wild and close relatives, we still want to make sure that we have those in case if at some point in time these other industrial crops are not able to, we can't reproduce with them, and so we can bring in wild or close relatives to create potentially new crops. So there are several of those centers. There are 11 plant-based centers with over 750,000 accessions of those crops. We also have the International Plant Genetic Resource Institute, this Botanic Gardens Conservation International. They have over about 24,000 species. So this Svalbard Global Seed Vault is in Norway. It's above the Arctic Circle, and it has over 930,000 seed samples. They have a sophisticated system for keeping these seeds preserved. We also have the National Plant Germplasm System. This is actually in Fort Collins, Colorado. They have 23 repositories, and they are evaluating many of those germplasms at these state experimental stations. So we have our major agronomic crops, Arctic plants, some desert legumes, some ornamentals, and others. We just want to make sure that we have a large variety in case if we ever need to repopulate certain crop species. We also have the National Plant Germplasm System. So if you wanted some germplasm, if you get into plant breeding, you can petition these systems to provide you with some germplasm. You must be qualified. Like we probably couldn't just say, "Hey, I need some germplasm." Like there would have to be a reason for that. So we do have the potential for new crops so that we can reduce the reliance on the ones that we have now. Just to look at some of those that may end up being that you might see in the future. And that's pretty much it for about classification. It wasn't a very long chapter. It was just kind of to introduce the classification, the taxonomy, and then that we're trying to save these germplasms so that we could repopulate plant populations or crop production systems should they ever fail. So, all right. Next is chapter 11. That's photosynthesis and respiration. That is going to be partially some notes and some slides like this, and then a few YouTube videos. I think I have a few YouTube videos that are going to explain that a little bit better and a little. It's just it's well put together, and I think it'll give you a better idea of what's actually going on in there. Okay, see you in chapter 11.